Some of you might be thinking, wait a second, that scripture that RJ read sounds awfully familiar. And if that's the case, it tells me you're paying attention. This is good. Paying attention in church is a good thing. Yes, indeed, it is the same gospel text that we heard last week. The deal is the stewardship campaign that we're doing this year. Homeland Ministries figured that since most churches have their annual business meetings sometime around the end of October, that they would get something that would be kicked off on World Communion Sunday. But we do things a little different here at First Christian Church, right? For one thing, not many pastors have the audacity to not be around on World Communion Sunday. So anyway, second of all, most pastors don't have the audacity to be away 2 Sundays in 1 month, like me. So what we're going to do, and plus, not many churches have their business meeting, their Transformation Sunday in the end of November. So the way we worked it out, we'll still be able to get the fullness of our stewardship emphasis, but we're just doing it on our time, which means we get to hear this text from Matthew twice. But that is good, because it's good to hear Scripture sometimes more than once, because sometimes we pick up on different things when we hear them at different times. So this year's stewardship emphasis isn't going to be, give more, so that our institution can get the financial support that it needs to be a glorious institutional presence here in Chico, California. That's not what it's about. And if that's the only reason a church exists, then I think it's time to let that sort of church die. But here at First Christian Church in Chico, I think that the reason why we endeavor to be a better stewardship church, the way we endeavor to be better stewards, is in response to the presence of the living Christ. Because Matthew's gospel is the most Jewish flavored of the gospels, the emphasis on this account of the Last Supper is on the Passover meal, that the Last Supper that Jesus shared with his disciples was a Passover meal. And the Passover meal is all about God's presence at the table. In fact, the table has always been an integral part of the Jewish tradition. Take the tabernacle, for example. Along with the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle is what the people of Israel carried with them through the wilderness all during their wanderings, all the way up until they took control of Canaan. And as they were traveling and were ready to make camp, they would set up this tent, which they also sometimes would call a booth or a tabernacle. If you ever hear in the Jewish tradition, if they ever talk about the festival of booths, that's what they're talking about, the tabernacle. So Aaron, who served as the high priest, would go in and cover up the Ark of the Covenant, and then he would spread a blue cloth over the table of the bread of presence. And he would set it with all sorts of plates and dishes and bowls and a casket. What do you pour wine in? What do you call it? It starts with it. Carafe, thank you. Carafes, all sorts of things like that. Sounds almost like a mess hall tent, more so than it is a tent of worship. And then there was the altar where they would make their animal sacrifices. Now here's where we often misunderstand what their worship was all about. Because see, what happened at this altar wasn't some bloody sacrifice to appease an angry and wrathful and vengeful God. It was an invitation for God to come sit at the table. Because why else would there be platters and bowls and carafes and things like that at the table? And the meal was lavish too. The choice wines, the best meat, the best grains, the best of everything. It made sense to have a regular dinner date with God, to keep God's presence at the table. What you didn't want was for an invitation to be declined. You didn't want to get a message that said, "I despise your festivals and take no delight in your solemn assemblies. And even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of the well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. You didn't want to hear that. Now, the God of Israel, Isaac, and Jacob is someone who wants everyone to have enough. Don't invite me to the table unless you are willing to invite others too. God lavishly spreads hospitality. God liberates slaves. God clothes the naked. God heals the sick. If you want God to come to your dinner table, if you want God to come to your party, you had better willing to be able to do the same too. Because justice has got to be on the menu. And when it is, and God shows up, the promise is that nobody leaves hungry. This offering of the people to God becomes the gift of God back to the people. And any theology of giving needs to be a theology of receiving as well. You set out 12 loaves. Why? Well, 12 represents the 12 tribes of Israel. It represents the whole people of God. It's offered to God, and then God offers it right back to the people. People can reach out to God, and God reaches out to the people. God and the people of God become family. And what do families do together? They eat together. They sit at the table together. So fast forward a couple of thousand years to the scripture that RJ read about the Passover meal that Jesus shared with his disciples. What do we see here? Well, we see the birth of the idea that when we approach the Lord's table, we do so because Christ invites us. And who did Jesus invite as his disciples? Well, he had a motley crew of people. He had fishermen. He had zealots. He had tax collectors. He even had somebody among those 12 who would betray him. Come as you are. I am the one who sets the table for you. See the difference there? When we celebrate the Lord's table, we emphasize the presence of the risen Christ. It is not our own efforts that earn or win us a place at the table. We are the ones who are invited. And while we're at the table, it is Christ who sets our agenda. We receive our mission. We're equipped for ministry. God calls us to do what Jesus did. And this has some pretty amazing implications when you relate it to our stewardship. Because so often in the church, we think that we are the ones who set the agenda for the mission and ministry of the church. We're the ones who map everything out and hope that God blesses it. We set the course. So here's a question for you, and it's not a rhetorical question. How do we usually determine what direction we take in the church most of the time? Yeah, that's something we should do. What do we usually do, though? Pardon?
Go with what's been happened before.
Okay, go with what has happened before? Okay, but what if there is this great idea? What if there is just an amazing way that we can use our gifts and graces for ministry and that God has blessed us with? Almost everyone agrees that it's a great idea. And we think, wow, this sounds great.
See if it's in the budget.
See if it's in the budget. Exactly. Pardon? Form a committee and see if we have the money for it. Exactly. And we might be able to say, oh, we could really make an impact here. This feels authentic. This fits. We could do this. We are the gifted people of God, and we can. How much is this going to cost? And then what happens to that idea? Down the drain. Okay, but what if this is a God thing? What if there are all sorts of divine neon lights just flashing, and there's this clear sense of direction? Well, that's a peachy idea on paper and all, but we're just not going to be able to afford that. And that's before even a single dime is spent. How much will this cost? So we figure out how much money we can scrape together, and we say, well, even though this mission objective seems like a great idea and all, we're going to have to scale it down, or we're going to have to just table it all together and find something that we can afford. But here's the deal. A church's budget should not be what dictates a church's mission and ministry. The church's mission and ministry is what should dictate the budget. When we let our mission be driven by budget, it is because we are driven by fear. We cannot clearly see what we're working with. So rather than being energized by our faith, we become paralyzed by our fear. One of the things that I love about modern movies that you can take home with you, you know how we used to have little VHS tapes and you'd pull it in there and you'd get the movie and that's it. But now you get these menus with all sorts of extras that you can see. And one of the things that I like is sometimes when a director does an alternate ending. Sometimes, and maybe it's just the director's way of saying, here's the original ending I had. Aren't you glad I did the better one? So this morning, I want to give you the alternate ending to the Exodus story. And I've got a couple of helpers who are going to help me out with this. The people are out in the wilderness. They're hungry. They are tired of wandering. They're still dealing with the shock and trauma of being abused by their captors. They're wondering if they've made the right choice.
Moses, how do we know where our next meal is coming from?
God will provide. That's God's promise.
But how do we know that's true?
Well, if you've noticed, every morning we get up, we have this manna stuck on the ground. We eat it, it gives us nourishment for the day, and we have the strength to keep going.
Yeah, but what if it doesn't come?
That's not an issue. God said it'll be here every morning.
But how can we know for sure? I'm not even sure this stuff is healthy for us. Remember when we put some in sacks? It was rotten the next day.
But God told us this would happen if we tried to store it.
Yeah, but what if that wasn't true either?
What do you mean either? Everything God said to us has been true.
We just can't moving forward every day if we don't know where our next meal is coming from.
But we do know.
No business would ever be able to survive with this mentality. You can't plan ahead unless you're certain what's going to happen.
Who says we're a business? We're a...
We have mouths to feed. We have bills to pay. This is just foolishness to think we're going to survive without a game plan.
But we do have a game plan. God promised that.
Oh, we've heard enough promises in our lifetime. No more. We're not taking another step forward until we know exactly what's ahead of us.
And so the people of Israel made camp in the wilderness and promised that they would never move another inch until they could see in writing what they had to work with. And so they died slowly, painfully, of starvation and boredom. The end. Now, I like the ending of the final cut that's in the Bible, don't you? I like that ending better. When God's people come to the Lord's table, we do so because we recognize the power and the presence of the living, risen Christ. We recognize that it is Christ who invites us to the table, not the other way around. This prompts us and encourages us to approach ministry, mission, and stewardship totally differently than if we believed that we're just winging it by ourselves. Would you pray with me?